The private estates of the Queen Mother were never merely mansions. They were sophisticated stages where history was softened by the glow of peach-hued lamps and politics shifted with the seating plans. From the ancient stones of Glamis to the wild cliffs of Scotland, she used these homes as precision tools for survival. But hidden inside a single lamp at Clarence House lay a secret note that explained everything. This is the story of how she built a world of care, silence, and endurance, one room at a time. Chapter 1. The Architecture of Light. In the shifting spring of 1952, one of Britain's most iconic figures found herself suddenly widowed. When the king died at Sandringham that February, the structure of the monarchy changed overnight. By the time the season turned, his widow had moved her entire household to Clarence House. The building had been hers before the war, then a headquarters during the conflict, and later a temporary home for the young Princess Elizabeth. Now, it returned to her, not as the seat of a queen consort, but as the residence of the Queen Mother. The staff immediately began the quiet, meticulous work of arranging a new life. Furniture arrived from storage. Paintings were hung with geometric precision. Lamps found their designated places on polished tables. One of those lamps stood in a private sitting room on the first floor. It featured a pale silk shade and a porcelain base painted with delicate garden roses. When lit, it cast what the household famously called peach light, a specific luminance warm enough to soften grief, bright enough to read by, and flattering without drawing attention to itself. Decades later, during a routine inventory in the early 2000s, a conservator opened the lamp's base to check the vintage wiring. Inside, hidden away, was a handwritten note, folded twice. It was dated 1952. The handwriting was feminine and slightly unsteady. It thanked the Queen Mother for a kindness the writer would never forget, specifically mentioning the lamp that made sorrow bearable. The signature was illegible, likely that of a young widow received during those raw, early months. This discovery revealed the true purpose of her estates. They were not museums or symbols of status. They were tools. She used the house as a tool for emotional management. She understood that a grieving guest needs soft light more than empty words. She knew that the architecture of a room could shelter a person's dignity. The Queen Mother did not simply live in these houses. She operated them. She used texture, temperature, and light to create an atmosphere where people felt seen, shaping memory and loyalty through the rigorous application of comfort. Chapter 2. The Garden of Choices. To understand how she mastered the art of using space, one must look to where she began. The question of her birth has always carried a haze of ambiguity. While official records name Hitchin, Hertfordshire, and some accounts suggest a London townhouse, her mother once suggested she was born at St. Paul's, Walden Bury. This was the family estate where the Bowslyan children spent their summers and where Elizabeth passed the defining years of her childhood. The uncertainty of the record seems fitting. Old money often prefers a compelling story over a precise coordinate. St. Paul's, Walden Bury supplied the perfect setting for her formation. The estate covered acres of woodland and gardens in Hertfordshire, anchored by a Queen Anne house of red brick and sash windows. It was comfortable, lacking the ostentation of a palace, but the gardens were extraordinary, laid out in the 18th century. The grounds featured radiating avenues long, grassy walks cut through high beech hedges. Each straight line drew the eye toward a specific focal point: a statue, a small temple, or a clearing. The design was intentional and psychological. The layout encouraged the walker to wander, yet always provided a clear destination. You were invited to choose your path, but the architecture quietly guided your experience. Elizabeth learned early on that a garden could serve as a stage. She understood that space could steer feeling, and that the right setting could make a planned conversation feel entirely accidental. In 1920, she was 19 years old. Prince Albert, known to the family as Bertie, was 24. He had proposed to her twice, and twice she had declined, fearful of the suffocating duties of royal life. He proposed a third time in the spring of 1923, within the quiet sanctuary of the woods at St. Paul's Waldenbury. This time, she said yes. The location was not a coincidence. This was her ground, her childhood territory. If she was to surrender her private freedom to the monarchy, she would do so in the one place where she felt she still controlled the atmosphere. Chapter 3. The Fortress of Legend. If St. Paul's Waldenbury was a choice, Glamis Castle was a destiny. The Bowes-Lyon family had held this seat since 1372, possessing 600 years of stone, legend, and feudal obligation. When Elizabeth married Bertie, Glamis became an inseparable part of her public identity. The press romanticized her as the girl from Glamis, spinning fairy tales for the public. The reality of the castle, however, was far colder and more formidable. Glamis sits in Angus, Scotland, roughly 17 miles north of Dundee. The structure is massive, a fortress of towers and turrets with walls thick enough to withstand a medieval siege. The central tower dates to the 14th century, with additions arriving in waves over the ensuing hundreds of years. By the time Elizabeth arrived as the Duchess of York, Glamis was steeped in folklore. Stories circulated of a secret room, a hidden monster, and a card game with the devil that never ended. Locals famously avoided the castle gates after dark. She did not fight these legends. She simply warmed the rooms within them. She understood that a trace of darkness makes the interior light feel safer. Fires were kept burning in the great grates. The kitchens produced food meant to fortify against the Scottish winter, steaming roasts and heavy breads. She redecorated the family rooms with softer colors and more lamps, creating a refuge within the stone. In August of 1930, she chose this fortress for the birth of her second daughter. Princess Margaret was not born in a sterile London hospital or a royal palace, but at Glamis, during a storm where the wind rattled the ancient windows. The birth transformed the castle from a haunted relic into a place of life. Elizabeth had performed a distinct alchemy. She took a cold, remote building filled with strange history and made it a home. She proved that even a fortress could be softened if one understood how to manage the temperature, both of the air and of the mood. Glamis taught her that you belong to history, but you can still make it comfortable. Chapter 4. The Art of Sanctuary. When the king died, the Queen Mother needed a residence that was entirely her own, a place to project her new identity. She found it at Clarence House, built in 1827 by John Nash for the Duke of Clarence. The pale stone building overlooks the Mall, situated close enough to Buckingham Palace to remain relevant, but distant enough to allow for independence. She moved in during the summer of 1953, turning the residence into a masterclass of hospitality. This move marked the decisive turn in her life. At 52, she had no constitutional role and could have easily faded into a quiet retirement. Instead, she turned Clarence House into a center of influence. She brought in her own decorator, someone who shared her belief that lighting was the most critical element of interior design. They installed the signature peach-toned lamps at eye level, ensuring that everyone in the room looked healthy and rested. Mirrors were placed opposite windows to double the natural light without creating glare. The proportions of the rooms were grand, but she softened the palette with blues, creams, and garden tones. Flowers were changed twice a week, always seasonal and never scented heavily enough to distract. The dining room became her laboratory for social engineering. Seating was never left to chance. She placed guests with the precision of a director casting a play. A shy guest would be seated near someone warm. Political rivals were separated by a centerpiece and 3 chairs. Lunch was served at 1:15 p.m., never earlier. Guests arrived at 1:00 p.m. for gin and tonics, allowing exactly enough time to settle nerves. The meal lasted until 3:00 p.m., long enough for real candor but short enough to prevent fatigue. The staff called this engineering. The atmosphere was so carefully constructed that guests forgot they were being managed. For nearly 50 years, Clarence House was the place where loyalty was built and wounds were soothed, all because the Queen Mother created a space that felt less like a royal court and more like a sanctuary. Chapter 5. The Engineering of Ease. The machinery of hospitality at Clarence House was invisible, but its rules were absolute. A guest was expected to arrive at 5 minutes past 1. To arrive early suggested anxiety. To arrive late suggested disrespect. The Queen Mother's invitations were precise, and the household operated on a rhythm that tolerated no deviation. When a guest arrived, the door opened before they could knock. The butler watched from a window, timing his descent to meet the visitor exactly at the threshold. Inside, the environment was already calibrated. By early afternoon, the harsh sun was filtered through curtains drawn to half-mast. Lamps were lit, not to illuminate the room, but to banish shadows from faces. The result was an even, flattering glow that made everyone appear at their best. The drawing room was arranged to facilitate flow. Vases of flowers, pale roses in January. Peonies in June stood where they caught the light but never blocked sightlines. The Queen Mother's chair was positioned to face the door at an angle, allowing her to see arrivals without appearing to watch them. The temperature was strictly controlled. 70 degrees in winter, 68 in summer. Fires were tended every 90 minutes, kept low enough to warm the spirit without overheating the room. Drinks arrived within 2 minutes of entry. The tray appeared without being summoned. The butler moved in soft-soled shoes, pouring and withdrawing in silence. The Queen Mother would lift her glass, a signal that settled the room without the need for a formal toast. Conversation always began with safe topics, usually gardens. Before moving to the dining room, the transition to lunch was seamless. The dining room sat 12 people, the maximum number for a single conversation. The Queen Mother sat center left, avoiding the head of the table to encourage participation. Courses were timed to the cadence of the talk. If the conversation deepened, service slowed. If energy flagged, plates were cleared. The butler read the room like a conductor, ensuring that the machinery of service supported the human interaction rather than interrupting it. Chapter 6. The Invisible Orchestra. This effortless atmosphere required a team of experts who understood that their true job was not service, but orchestration. The butler, William Talon, known to the family as Backstairs Billy, joined the household in 1953 and stayed for 51 years. By the end, he knew the Queen Mother's rhythms better than she did. His primary responsibility was time management. He ensured that doors opened, drinks appeared, and meals progressed at the exact psychological moment they were needed. He was the metronome of the house, the housekeeper, whose work was less visible but equally vital, managed the sensory experience. Floors were swept twice daily with soft brooms to avoid the harsh sound of scraping. Hinges were oiled monthly to ensure silence. Clocks were wound on Sundays and set 3 minutes fast, not enough to confuse a guest, but enough to keep the household slightly ahead of schedule. She controlled the thermal comfort with obsessive detail, placing thermometers in every room and adjusting radiators before the evening chill set in. The cook managed the emotional tone of the house through food. Breakfast was predictable toast and tea to build a sense of security. Lunch was substantial but traditional, featuring roast chicken or lamb cutlets. Dinner was theater, often 7 courses designed to pace the evening. But the cook's true skill lay in adaptation. If the Queen Mother was hosting a difficult guest, the menu became richer. Chocolate and cream were used to absorb tension. The lady's maid managed the visual projection. Clothes were selected the night before, chosen not just for style, but for their psychological effect on the specific guests attending. Pastels were worn for Americans, jewel tones for Europeans, and wool for the Scots. Jewelry was chosen to signal warmth or formality. Together, this staff formed a system. They did not merely clean and cook. They maintained a protective bubble. The butler kept time. The housekeeper kept warmth. The cook fed emotion, and the maid curated the image, allowing the Queen Mother to conduct the symphony. Chapter 7. The Breath of the Highlands. If Clarence House was a machine of social engineering, Birkhall was a place of breath. Located on the Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire, this house offered a reprieve from the rigid choreography of London. The Queen Mother made it her Scottish base. And here, the rules of engagement were entirely different. There was no butler's pantry, no formal seating plan, and no designed lighting. There was only stone, wood, and the sound of the River Muick rushing past the garden. At Birkhall, the dogs were allowed to sleep on the furniture. Corgis and Labradors sprawled across sofas, tracking mud through the hallways. And no one apologized for the mess. Guests quickly learned that if they wanted the best chair by the fire, they had to move a sleeping dog themselves. Wellington boots, caked with the distinct earth of the Highlands, stood by the door, and waxed jackets hung on pegs in the entry. The house smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and pine. Meals were simple. Porridge was served for breakfast, sandwiches for lunch, and perhaps a salmon caught that morning for dinner. The dining table seated 10, and guests passed the dishes themselves. There were no footmen hovering, no service from the left. If you wanted potatoes, you reached for them. The conversation here was quieter, stripping away the performance of London society. People spoke of fishing, the weather, and the condition of the paths. The Queen Mother walked every morning at 8:00 a.m., regardless of the rain, dressed in a heavy coat and headscarf, walking stick in hand. She followed the route down to the river and through the birch grove that gave the house its name. The goal was not exercise. The goal was silence. London was a place of talk. Scotland was a place of breathing. The house was intimate, with lower ceilings and narrower hallways than her other residences. Fires burned peat, filling the rooms with a sweet, ancient smoke. It was a space designed for decompression, where the house as a tool meant a tool for rest. Chapter 8. The discipline of solitude. Even in the relaxation of Scotland, her mind remained disciplined. The Queen Mother's routine was anchored by two pillars: horses and books. At Birkhall, she rode 3 mornings a week. By 8:00 am, the groom would have a bay mare ready, steady, reliable, and calm. She rode alone, without security or companions, disappearing into the pine woods to think on horseback. The rhythm of the ride allowed her thoughts to wander unburdened by the need to direct a conversation. She often said that her clearest instincts about people whom to trust and whom to keep at a distance arrived during those solitary rides. She returned by 9:30 a.m. for tea and correspondence. Even here, letters arrived daily. She read every invitation and request with a fountain pen in hand, marking the margins with single-word instructions. Yes, no, later. Her decisions were based on gut instinct, honed by decades of observation. Her reading habits shifted with her geography. In London, the library at Clarence House was stocked with biographies of figures like Disraeli and Elizabeth I. She read to understand power, how it is won, how it is lost, and how one survives being misunderstood. In Scotland, however, she turned to novels. She read Trollope, Austen, and Sayers, studying the social architecture of fictional drawing rooms. She read every night, propped up against pillows with her lamp angled low. She underlined passages that resonated with her understanding of human nature, noting phrases that described ambition or humility. These books were tools just as much as the horses were. They allowed her to study the world without engaging with it. She learned that true power was not about volume, but about attention. The person who remembered the small details, who noticed when a guest was tired, held the room. She built this capacity for attention through her daily practice of reading and writing, sharpening the instincts that made her hospitality so effective. It was a discipline of the mind, disguised as leisure. Chapter 9. The Castle at the Edge. In October of 1952, 6 months after the king's death, she saw a ruin that would become her most personal project. While driving in Caithness, she spotted the Castle of Mey sitting on a low rise near the Pentland Firth. It was abandoned, with a failing roof and windows broken by the coastal winds. Thistles grew waist-high against the gray stone walls. Yet, she saw the bones of the place, the thick walls, and the clear, pale northern light. She bought it for a modest sum, ignoring the advice of her counselors who deemed it unsalvageable. This was the only house she ever owned outright, bought with her own money and restored with her own vision. The work began in 1953. She hired local stonemasons from Thurso and roofers who understood the brutal climate. They stripped the rotting slate, repaired the timber, and sealed the fissures in the stone. Inside, she whitewashed the walls to reflect the scarce light. The gardens required a battle against the elements. She employed a landscape architect to build stone screens and planted hedges of escallonia to break the wind. Within these shelters, she created a walled garden where vegetables and roses could survive. She planted the first rose herself, watching it struggle and eventually thrive against the salt air. The Castle of Mey opened in the summer of 1955. She spent every August there, often alone or with a skeleton staff. The Pentland Firth is one of the most dangerous stretches of water in Britain, and she found the proximity to such wildness calming. This estate represented autonomy. It was not inherited or borrowed. It was saved. For 30 years, it served as her private fortress of freedom, a place at the edge of the map where the only schedule was the tide. Here, she did not have to be the Queen Mother. She could simply be the woman who had brought a ruin back to life, finding restoration for herself in the process of restoring the stone. Chapter 10. A Legacy of Care. By the 1960 seconds, a seasonal rhythm had established itself. Spring was for St. Paul's Waldenbury, summer for the duties of Glamis, August for the solitude of Mey, autumn for the warmth of Birkhall, and winter for the work of Clarence House. These 5 houses formed a complete ecosystem, balancing public duty with private breath. But as the decades passed, the cost of maintaining such a network grew, and the world outside began to change. Questions arose about the expense of these estates. In response, she began a quiet strategy of opening the gates. St. Paul's Waldenbury remained with her brother's family, but she stepped back. Glamis opened its doors to tourists, using the proceeds to maintain the roof. At Mey and Birkhall, she began hosting artists and writers, turning her private retreats into places of shared creativity. In London, she opened the gardens of Clarence House for charity events, allowing the public to walk the paths she loved. This was her final lesson. Care must eventually be shared. She established trusts to ensure the houses would survive her, transforming her private sanctuaries into enduring institutions. When she died in 2002 at the age of 101, the estates passed to new hands. But the atmosphere she created remained. The house as a tool had done its work. It had sheltered her through 50 years of widowhood and provided a stage for a softer kind of power. The letter hidden in the peachlight lamp at Clarence House remains the key to understanding her legacy. The young widow who wrote it had found the sorrow bearable not because of a grand gesture, but because of the specific quality of the light and the comfort of the room. The Queen Mother understood that a house is more than stone. It is a vessel for empathy. She left behind a system of care lamps lit at the right hour, fires tended with patience, and doors opened just enough to welcome the world in. If you found this story meaningful, feel free to like and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching until the end. How did you feel about this video? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Empire Legacies truly appreciates your support.